for me, the strategy for the quiz on Wednesday would be, I think chapter 3 would be a bit more of a difficult concept to grasp based on ano yung mga natututunan natin with accounting. So for me, if may exercises tayong due for Wednesday, my suggestion is try to finish it now at the early portion of the weekend so that come Wednesday, ang focus nyo is preparing for the quiz. Now, there's pros and cons for the quiz being moved on Wednesday. The pro would be syempre you have more time to study for it and more time to parang understand the journal entries. Pero the con would be baka malito kayo sa concepts from chapter 3. So my request lang would be let's be strategic about it. Kung if it's a chapter 1, chapter 2 quiz, don't overthink it. Wala muna yung accruals or deferrals. So basically whatever we're gonna be discussing today, parang it's not expected na that's something na will be discussed on the quiz. So with that said, ano yung mga things that you should focus on? Chapter 1, definitely yung mga fundamental concepts. Chapter 1, what would be parang kailangan experts na kayo in terms of creating the various statements and the various tools. Chapter 2, it's really more about journal entries and trial balances. So for me, try nyo lang i-review yung both problem sets 1 and problem sets 2 in preparation for the quiz. So again, it's not enough na you get it right. It's really more about understanding and doing it fast. So medyo mahaba yung quiz on Wednesday just because it's a combination of 2 chapters. So yun, kailangan lang mas mabilis tayo. So with that said, I think we can officially begin chapter 3. So like what I mentioned, week 3, so this is my note. So there's 4 major topics for the first long exam for accounting. And chapter 3 out of the 4 would be the parang most difficult concept to grasp. So chapter 1 and 2, high learning curve pero it's very straightforward. Chapter 3 is not as intuitive. So I think out of the 4, ito yung medyo nahihirapan yung mga tao. So what are we gonna be talking about this week? So basically, we're done na understanding the whole recording process. So we've understand na, okay, first step, you analyze. The second step is you journalize your entries. And then third, you would post to your trial balance so that finally you can create financial statements. So very straightforward. So the question is, parang how can parang accounting become more complex or more difficult? Well, definitely, we're just looking at it kasi in previous examples in one time period. But accounting, as you know, is our daily record. So parang it's a record from time period to the next. And therefore, because of that, kailangan one of the key concepts that we have to understand is because of the parang different time periods, how do we actually adjust the accounts that affect or transactions that affect a company across different time periods? And then dun yung papasok yung concept of accruals and deferrals, right? So let's go on a quick overview in terms of parang what we'll be discussing today. So again, sorry, naka-freeze pala. So again, it's really more of first, let's understand the business context. So in terms of the underlying principles, we mentioned that time period assumption is one of them. Number 2, we'll just quickly talk about ano ba yung fina-follow natin na accounting. Is it a cash basis versus accrual basis? So I think this is the first time you probably hear accrual outside your daily life. And then from there, pag clear na tayo which basis we follow, we now master the journal entries. So how do we actually account for transactions in terms of like yung mga prepayments and our accruals or accruals and deferrals? But before that, we'll just talk about the matching principle real quick. And then finally, analyzing the financial statements. So for this portion, what we're going to be focusing lang would be, instead of just the trial balance, there's another step wherein we'll try to adjust the trial balance based on the adjusting journal entries that we'll be making. So with that clear in terms of like the overall flow, now's the perfect time to let's take a deep dive in terms of like the time period assumption. So review lang in terms of like our first chapter discussion. Basically, we had 4 underlying principles that built up our accounting foundation. And basically, these are our building blocks on which financial accounting measurement is based. Kaya siya standardized across different industries, across different countries, etc., etc., right? And with that said, out of those four, the one that we're gonna be paying close attention to would be the time period. So again, refresher lang. So the time period is basically the accounting practices and methods wherein dapat insured ka na kung ano yung pinipili mong reporting or ano yung ginagamit mong standard, it's maintained and reported for specific periods of time. And dapat consistent siya for each of the time period that that business is in operation. So kind of hard to imagine. But in reality, I think it's easier to look at it in a parang very practical perspective. So when we talk about business entities, so parang pare, when we talk about our lives, we talk about it as human life, right? But if you're a business entity, you call it your economic life. And unlike us, na parang we celebrate in terms of like mga birthdays, etc., mas may flexibility ka in terms of dividing the economic life of the business. So let's say we have this economic entity, and then again, going concern assumption, parang regardless, parang ang assumption natin is hindi siya magko-close down tomorrow, hindi siya magko-close down next month. It will probably go on in terms of its operation. So what do you call that lifespan? You call that the economic life of business. Now, it's kind of hard to compare 5-year-old company with a 1-year-old company if hindi natin i-break down yung life nila, right? It's kind of hard to imagine. So therefore, you have to break them down into artificial time periods. So in terms of the economic life, may period 1, period 2, period 3. I think the easiest way to look at it is you look at it yearly. So January to December, that's year 1, year 2, year 3. So bakit period 1, period 2, period 3? Because there are different ways of breaking about it. But simply put, it's like year 1, year 2, year 3. So basically, yung ginagawa natin na financial statements, we do it per period. Meaning, we check their performance and their financial period per period. So ano ba yung performance niya based on the income statement and how did the changes in equity change for that particular period, be it a month, a year, etc., etc. And then your balance sheet will give you an update ano yung financial position niya at the end of that period. Right? So pag period 2, gagawa ka na naman ng another set. Period 3, gagawa ka na naman ng another set. So that's when you can compare the period of of business entity 1 with the period of another company. So now, how do we actually break the different time periods? So there are 3 ways. One would be calendar year. So calendar year, January to December. Fiscal year, if you see that term, it's basically a 12-month period wherein basically either September year 1 to September year 2, or it could be an interim period. So parang less than 12 months. So that's the more parang uncommon. So you have your calendar year, you have your fiscal year, and then you have your interim period. So now, ano ba yung source ng problem natin? Nung chapter 2, malinis kasi. Whatever happened in the transactions, nako-close siya within that period. Wala siya masyadong jump towards like the different other periods. But because, as entities come and go, parang there would be different transaction effects that would cross from period 1 all the way to period 2, or even sometimes across different multiple periods. So now the question is, how do we account for these transactions? Now, parang before we answer that, the first question that we have to answer muna would be, there's this thing called cash basis and accrual basis. So what would those mean, right? So hint, yung major topic natin for today is accruals and deferrals. So the question is, ano ba ang ibig sabihin ng accrual, right? So basically, there's 2 different ways, right? So on one hand, you have cash basis wherein nagjo-journal entry ka whenever cash is received or paid. So ang pakialam mo lang is, pumasok ba yung cash? Lumabas ba yung cash? If may pumasok na cash or may lumabas na cash, that's the only time I'll record my journal entries. Versus accrual basis is that transactions are recorded not when you receive or you pay cash, but when revenues and expenses are incurred, right? So cash basis, when cash is received or paid, doon ka lang mag-journal entry. Accrual basis, kapag nagkaroon ka ng incurrence sa expense or revenue, mag-record ka regardless kung gumalaw ba yung cash mo or not. So, I know it's kind of hard to understand. So let's go back to Kevin Trin Welding. So as you remember, si Kevin Trin started a welding business nung June. And then he had around 5 economic events that happened. Now, para ma-appreciate natin, ano ba difference ng cash basis and accrual basis? Let's now create the journal entries for each. So first, June 1, nag-invest siya ng cash. Okay, so may cash na gumalaw. Therefore, in cash basis, you'll record debit cash, credit owner's capital, 4,400. Sa accrual basis, it's the same. Cash owner's capital. So first event, wala pang change. Now let's go to June 2. He purchased equipment on account for 990. So we know, tumaas yung equipment niya. But paano niya binayaran yung equipment? Not through cash, but through accounts payable. Umutang siya. So now, for cash basis, the question is, gumalaw ba yung cash or hindi? Well, hindi siya gumalaw. Therefore, under cash basis, wala kang entry. But as you know, tayo, ang ginawa natin was, we recorded debit equipment, credit accounts payable, 99. Next, June 3, 880 cash is paid to the landlord. So may cash na naman. So we'll record debit rent expense, 880, cash, 880. And then same lang. So same, see accrual basis. So now, June 12, nag-bill ka raw ng $930 worth of welding work you've done. So now, may gumalaw bang cash? Wala. So therefore, no entry kay cash basis. Pero sa atin, ang ginawa natin before is debit accounts receivable, credit service revenue of 930. And then finally, you receive money from the partial payment. So here, ang gagawin mo is naka-receive ko ng cash, so dun mo lang i-recognize yung revenue. Debit cash of 450, credit service revenue of 450. Whereas tayo, alam na natin that that cash pinababa lang yung accounts receivable natin na 930. So therefore, ang magiging ano natin is cash cash, and then that should be accounts receivable 450, right? So now, if you notice, because iba yung mga journal entries natin, so basically in June 2 and June 12, nung walang gumalaw na cash, wala tayong journal entries. Obviously, yung trial balance under a cash basis and accrual basis would be different. So for cash basis, you'll have this trial balance. For accrual basis, you'll have the trial balance on the right. So ito, 4,650 yung balance ng debits and credits niya. Ito, 6,320. But as you know, the question is, and ito lang yung pinaka-importanting part ng section is, ano ba yung pina-follow natin in 99.1? Well, the answer is, and I think that's obvious naman, we follow accrual basis. And the reason is, marami kang mawawalang information if you're just gonna look at your cash. Like, hindi mo malalaman kung ano yung mga expenses na nag-incur, hindi mo malalaman kung ano yung actual revenues. Mahuhuli ka in terms of like knowing when or parang when the transactions actually happen. Therefore, parang the key here, so two things lang yung kailangan kong you need to understand. One is what's the difference between cash basis and accrual basis. So mag-record ka lang kapag may cash. And then second, for accrual basis, yun yung pina-follow natin in terms of accounting. So clear, accrual basis yung pina-follow natin. So now, the last concept before we can get into the journal entry of things would be the matching principle. So, okay, we've established. Under accrual basis, we make journal entries when revenues and expenses are incurred versus cash basis, gagawa ka lang ng journal entries when, you know, cashes are paid out or received. So going back, ang difference lang ng cash basis is dun sa Kevin Trin example, parang kapag wala kang cash, hindi ka mag-entry. Pero pag may revenues expenses kang incurred, regardless of may cash or hindi, mag-record ka for accrual basis. Now, the question is, when do revenues and expenses, when do they occur? Parang when are they recognized, right? And this is where papasok yung matching principle. So first, baliin natin. First is revenue recognition. When do you recognize revenue? Honestly, there's a whole definition or even like a whole parang chunk of parang discussion on when you should recognize revenue. But in essence, it's when you increase, parang you recognize an increase in the future economic benefits has occurred. So again, marami yan. Parang first, kailangan mo munang identify yung contract, kung verbal agreement ba, etc., etc. You'll identify na ano ba yung obligation ni party 1 kay party 2. So parang for example, I'm selling I'm selling an iPhone 15. So the contract is nagsisell ako ng phone to another person. So we have go into a personal agreement. Ang obligation ko is ibibigay ko sa kanya yung phone, but in exchange, bibigyan niya ako ng pera. So that's obligation. Number 3 is determine the price. So magkano ko ba binibenta? Let's say binibenta ko siya 50,000. And then you allocate the price to the obligation. So ito, 50,000 for one phone. And then recognize the revenue when the obligation is satisfied. Meaning, pag nabenta ko na sa kanya, that's when I receive the revenue, right? So basically, ang sinasabi lang dito is, you recognize revenue only when you have rendered the service or may full delivery ka of the item. Yun lang, simple. So, kuwari, nagpa-part-time ako to tutor people. And then, ang singil ko is like 200 pesos per session, or 200 pesos per month. If someone paid me 200 pesos at the start of the month for one session, I should not recognize revenue yet. Kasi hindi ko pa naman siya natuturuan right? So, again, you only recognize revenue when you have rendered a service to them already. Or the item is fully delivered. On the other hand, you recognize expenses when there is a decrease in future economic benefits. Pero, unlike revenue na marami siyang parang mga different requirements, etc., the matching principle should be states lang that expenses should be recognized in the same period a relevant revenue is recognized. So let's make sense out of this. So gawa tayo ng example. Let's say that I'm a car manufacturer, right? And I'm selling a cool ray. So basically, in terms of like making that car, you have to understand that there's two components. Yung cost mo of the parts of the car, and then yung selling price mo. So, siyempre, yung selling price mo, papatungan mo yung cost mo. So, let's say, yung costs mo for making this particular car, like the tires, the cars, parts, engine, etc., total to around 800,000 pesos. So, dahil yung cost mo is around 800,000 pesos, syempre, hindi mo siya ibebenta at 800,000. You'll probably sell it at a much higher markup. So, let's say, ibebenta mo siya of a selling price of around 1.2 million. So, what does matching principle state? The matching principle states that you should not recognize expenses unless na-recognize mo na yung corresponding revenue of that particular item. So, in 2021, car was not sold. So, under the matching principle, dahil wala tayong revenue, we should not recognize the expense. But then the question is, paano natin ika-categorize yung 800,000? Well, yung 800,000 na nagastos mo, instead of treating it as an expense first, we would treat it as inventory. So inventory is an asset. So inventory is an asset na you're expecting na you'll get money from it pag nabenta mo siya, right? So again, matching principle, hindi siya expense at 2021. Now let's go to the next time period. In 2022, the car was finally sold. So the question is, may revenue ba tayong ma-recognize? Of course, we'll have the 1.2 million sales revenue, right? So dahil may revenue na tayo, that's the only time we'll recognize na, yung 800,000 na yun, gagawin natin siyang expense. So parang in your head, parang what it will happen is in 2021, you will recognize debit inventory 800,000, credit cash 800,000. So yung ginastos mo, rather than treating it as an expense, you'll treat it first as an asset. And then, kapag nabenta mo na in the next period, matching principle will kick in. May sales revenue ako, then therefore, I will then make it na debit expense or cost of goods sold, which is the expense part, credit inventory, 800,000. So, from an asset, dun mo lang siya nilipat to an expense. So the question is, bakit natin ito ginagawa? Well, because parang wala masyadong fluctuations in terms of your accounting. Parang imagine mo, nagbibenta ka ng kotse tapos kakabahan ka kasi puro expense. Like mag-net loss ka ng sobrang laki. Wala kang na-recognize na revenue. So dapat, which is, to be fair, yun naman yung fair way of looking at it. Relax ka lang na parang actually asset to. And then magiging cost ko lang siya kapag nabenta ko siya. And then it's another separate scenario naman kung hindi mo siya mabenta, right? So, but let's not go into that. So, net, the matching principle is all about expenses should be recognized in the same period a relevant revenue is recognized. Yun. So basically, we're done now with understanding accrual basis, meaning that we're not just parang creating journal entries when cash is paid or not, but really when revenues and expenses are recognized. Number two, we know na when to recognize revenue and when to recognize expense. And then now we can finally go to the practical aspect of adjusting the entries. But before that, may any questions ba when regards to matching principle or accrual or cash basis? Okay. Sige. Okay. So with that said, we can now go to adjusting entries. So again, why do we need adjusting entries? Because adjusting entries will ensure that revenue and expense recognition principles are followed by the company. And then this is two things that you have to note about adjusting entries. So we made journal entries before, right? Adjusting entries is a separate set of entries you'll have to make. So number one, it's required every time a company prepares financial statements. So adjusting entries are required. And then the question is, kailan siya nangyayari? We do adjusting entries normally on the last day of an accounting period. So for example, September 2023, you'll have journal entries from September 1 to September 30 as normal, yung chapter 2 natin. But on September 30, on the last day, bago ka mag-prepare ng financial statements, you'll make adjusting entries. Now, the question is, why do we need adjusting entries? Hindi ba accurate na yung mga ginawa natin? Well, there are three reasons why. But ultimately, it's because trial balance may not contain up-to-date information. And why is that? So number one, some events are not recorded daily. So basically, it's too time-consuming or even costly. So for example, rent. Hindi mo naman i-relista yung rent mo as a daily expense, right? You'll have to break it down into time period. Magkano yung rent ko for year 1, magkano yung rent ko for year 2, magkano yung rent insurance expense ko for period 1, period 2. So rather than doing it every day na parang mababaliw ka, might as well recognize it whatever time it happens, but adjust it at the end of the period. Number two, some events are not journalized during period. So it expires with passage of time versus daily transaction. So later, you'll find out, and I think this is an allusion to the question na, why are equipment or why are property or why are furnitures assets and not direct expenses? It's because wala naman siyang daily usage. So parang for assets or property, yung expense niya is when it's all about the passage of time. And therefore, hindi mo siya magagawa ng daily transaction even if you wanted to. So, you just adjust it at the end of the period. And then, lastly, some items may be unrecorded. So, parang pare, accountant ako, 5 p.m. na on a Friday, last day of the month. And then, biglang nag-bill or parang merong accounts receivable. Syempre, parang ayaw mo na siya i-record, right? Kasi parang patapos na eh. So, nagawa mo na yung trial balance and then may pumasok pang items. And therefore, you need to adjust, right? So with that said, basically, for adjusting entries, ito lang naman yung kailangan natin i-master for chapter 3, right? So, there are two things that we mentioned. So, one, we have to master deferrals. And then second, we have to master accruals. So, big terms, but simply, deferrals are prepayments and accruals are incurrences. So, again, nagkakaroon lang naman tayo ng adjusting entries is because may nangyayari from one period to the next, right? So, therefore, it connotes na merong two periods or 2 points. Merong now at merong later. And dun ka sa later mag-a-adjust. Now, for me, para madali nyo ma-memorize to, for deferrals, ang iisipin nyo lang is that sa now, may cash impact. And then later, dun mo na lang i-recognize yung revenue and expenses. So for example, kaya siya tinawag na prepayment. So there are two kinds of deferrals. One, naka-receive ka ng cash and then later mo siya i-recognize as a revenue. Or second, nag-pay ka ng cash pero later mo pa siya i-recognize as an expense. So you receive or pay cash now, and then you recognize expense or revenue later. That's why dinedefer mo yung pag-recognize ng revenue and expense. Kaya siya deferrals. or prepayments. Prepayments signify that nauna mo na yung cash bago yung revenue or yung expense incurrence. On the other hand, you have accruals or incurrences. Ito baliktad. During the now, you will already recognize a revenue. Pero yung cash mo, later mo pa matatanggap. And then, on the other hand, sa expenses, ngayon mo na-recognize expense, pero later ka pa magpipay ng cash. So if in chapter 2, what I asked you to memorize was the normal balances for the different asset types. For me, ito yung kailangan yung ma-memorize and kailangan ma-take into account. So again, deferrals or prepayments, meaning you receive cash now, and then you defer the recognition of revenue and expenses. And then accruals, you incur kaagad. So you incur the revenue or expense, pero yung cash later muna. So tandaan nyo lang kung kailan yung cash impact. So again, deferrals, prepayment, and then accruals later. So now, cash now, pay cash now, receive pay cash now, deferrals. Later is receive cash, pay cash, accruals. So for us to understand, let's just go through a comprehensive problem called Putty Consulting. So let's imagine na Putty Consulting started March 31, 2020. So tapos na, we're at the last day of the accounting period. Nakagawa ka na ng journal entries, etc., etc. Nag-balance siya, thankfully, at 24,150. Total debits, total credits. Now, we have to make adjustments. So, tatlo lang naman yung gagawin natin for today. We have to learn how to record adjusting entries for deferrals, record adjusting entries for accruals, and then we have to adjust the trial balance. Right. So, with that said, let's first go to deferrals or prepayments, cash now. So for deferrals, so again, paulit-ulit, deferrals, cash now, so either you pay or receive cash now, you defer the recognition of revenue or expense later. So may two types lang. You have your prepaid expenses, and then you will have your unearned revenue. So prepaid expenses, unearned revenue, those are the two types of your deferrals. So prepaid expenses sound familiar because of prepaid rent, prepaid insurance. And if you think about it, that's the concept. You pay cash now, you treat it first as an asset, and then later mo na siya i-recognize as an expense. Right? So basically, yung pay cash is, you record an asset. So parang for example, I paid 6,000 for 6 months of rent. I will record prepaid rent of 6,000, credit cash of 6,000, right? So pay cash now. So before the adjustment, so let's say I paid in year 1, on day 1, yun, for 6 months. So after 1 month, technically 1 month of rent has expired, right? So bago natin siya i-adjust, ang mangyayari is that your assets are overstated and your expenses are understated, right? Kasi kware, 6,000, so day 1, okay pa ako, 6,000, pure asset yon. After 1 month, I've consumed 1 month's worth of rent. Technically, out of the 6,000, yung 1,000 for that particular month, dapat hindi na siya asset, dapat expense na siya. Nagamit mo na nakuha mo na as rent. So pag hindi mo in-adjust, and 6,000 pa si prepaid asset, at the end of the month, your assets will be overstated. Overstated si prepaid rent at 6,000. When in fact, it should be 5,000 na lang. Kasi may 1,000 siyang expense. And therefore, since hindi mo na-recognize yung 1,000 expense, expenses also will be understated. Therefore, the adjusting entry for prepaid expenses should be debit expense, credit asset. So in this case, rent expense of 1,000, debit, credit prepaid rent of 1,000. So don't worry, we'll have examples for each. Just wanted to have like this master formula for you. So ang kailangan nilang tandaan is, for prepaid expenses, we initially record an asset, and then pag hindi nyo siya in-adjust at the end of the period, assets will be overstated and expenses will be understated. And therefore, ang adjusting entry for prepaid expenses would be debit expense, credit asset. Baliktad naman sa unearned revenue. So let's go back to the tutoring part tutoring example. Pero para mas madali, let's say I offer my tutoring services for 100 per session. And then, parang ang nangyari is someone availed for 10 sessions, right? So at the start, makaka-receive na ako ng cash of 10,000. So I'll receive cash, so that would be an unearned revenue on my end. So ang mangyayari doon is debit cash of, let's say, 10 sessions of 100 is 1,000. So debit cash of 1,000, credit liability of 1,000. Ang pangalan ng liability na yon is unearned service revenue. Meaning, technically, hindi ko pa yung revenue. May obligation pa ako gawin yung 10 sessions with them bago ko siya kailangan i-recognize as revenue. Right? So, for unearned revenue, kailangan lang debit cash, credit, unearned service revenue. And then, let's say, at the end of the month, I was only able to teach them 5 sessions out of 10. So now, technically, yung liability ko, hindi naman pure 1,000. I earned a part of that, right? Parang half of that, or 5 out of 10, I earned. So I should recognize a revenue at the end of the month. So therefore, my adjusting entry would be unearned service revenue. So babawasan mo si unearned service revenue of 500. Recognize my service revenue of 500. Para alam ko na, out of the 1,000, yung 500 na earn ko na, yung other 500, may liability pa ako. So pag hindi nyo ginawa tong adjusting entry, ang mangyayari is your liabilities will be overstated. So pag hindi ko ginawa yung adjusting entry na yun, ang mangyayari is unearned service revenue 1,000. That's overstated. Hindi na 1,000 yung obligation ko sa kanya eh. 500 na lang. And then therefore, my revenues will also be understated kasi I didn't recognize the 500, right? So I know kind of hard to imagine. So for me, let's just master the examples, right? So first, let's go muna to prepaid expenses. Honestly, prepaid expenses, quote unquote, ginroup ko na lang siya into typical deferrals na may prepaid expenses. So tatlo. One would be supplies. Second would be prepaid rent or anything called prepaid. So prepaid insurance, etc., etc. And then third would be equipment. Okay? So first, let's go to supplies. Okay, so this is coming in from the whole case study. So basically, ito yung isang journal entry. Pwede Consulting purchased office supplies for 950 cash. After a month, the remaining office supplies amounted to $50. So basically, we need to look at it from a time period. So March 1 to March 31. So basically, let's say bumili ako ng A4 worth $950. So March 1, ganyan pa yung itsura niya. Pero come end of the month, $50 na lang. So probably, onti na lang yung paper na natira. Right? So basically, nagkaroon ng consumption na nangyari. So to fully understand the context, let's first understand ano ba yung journal entry niya nung start, nung nag-pay siya ng cash. Basically, ang journal entry niya, and I think dapat alam niyo na to, is debit supplies of 950, credit cash. Nakakuha ko ng supplies, nagbayad ako ng 950. Pero after, so that happened on March 1. Pero now, in March 31, your supplies shouldn't be 950 already kasi yung na-consume nyo na eh. So, na-consume nyo na, hindi na siya asset. So, before the adjustment, if itong 950 na to is in March 31, technically, your assets will be overstated. Why? Kasi, dapat at March 31, it should be 50. Pero it's at 950 now. So it's overstated. Therefore, ang adjustment natin is kailangan natin babaan ng 900. On the other hand, in terms of expense, wala ka pang expense at the start in March 1 kasi wala ka pang nagagamit na papel. Pero March 31, you've used up technically $900 worth of paper. So dapat yung March 31 mong expense should be 900. So that's why expenses are understated. Dapat 900 siya, pero it's understated to 0. So daw, ang adjustment lang natin is we have to increase it by 900. So simply, ang adjusting entry lang natin for supplies is supplies expense 900. So tumaas yung expense ng 900. Bumaba si asset na supplies ng 900. So in essence, parang I want you to think about it as at the start, supplies are assets. And then eventually, nakukonsume nyo siya. And then the adjusting entry is just to recognize how much was consumed for that particular period. Yun lang. Basically, ganun lang naman siya. So again, ulitin natin. Right? So you had an initial recording of supplies 950, cash 950. How would you solve for it mathematically, right? So basically, you look at ano ba yung per record. So currently, on March 31, before adjustment, my supplies is 950. Nung binilang mo on hand, $50 na lang pala. Therefore, by knowing kung ano talaga yung true ending balance of supplies, alam mo how much was used. 900 out of the 950 was used. And that should be recognized as an expense. And therefore, mag-adjusting entry tayo of debit supplies 900, credit supplies of 900. So, yung T account lang would be 900, 900. And then, ang importanteng tingnan dyan is the supplies. So, 950 siya at March 1. Nag-adjusting entry ka ng 900 at March 31, which will give you the true balance of the supplies of 50. Hindi na overstated si asset and hindi na understated si expense. Any questions for supplies or clear pa naman so far? So, ganun lang. So, basically, the idea lang here for all prepaid expenses is that may ibabayad kang cash na buo siya. Think of it as a pie. And di unti-unti nakakain mo siya and nagiging siyang expense. So, parang may asset ka na unti-unti kino-convert mo to expenses, right? So, same principle but different scenario. Let's go naman to prepaid rent. So, nag-rent raw siya ng office space sa HLC building and paid $3,000 for the first 3 months. So again, March 1, nag-rent ka raw ng 3 months. So ang journal entry natin, if this was any other chapter 2 question would be, prepaid rent of 3,000 debit, credit cash of 3,000. So tumaas yung asset ko of 3,000, bumaba yung cash ko of 3,000. Let's fast forward to March 31. How much of the prepaid rent of 3,000 do you think was consumed for 1 month? 1,000, correct. So therefore, dapat may 1,000 tayong expense na ma-recognize. So in March 31, yung prepaid rent, So prepaid rent would be dapat 2,000 na lang, hindi na 3,000. So therefore, again, overstated si asset. Si expense, on the other hand, since wala ka pang na-recognize, expenses are understated. So, ano yung kailangan nating adjusting entry? Kailangan bumaba si prepaid rent, which is an asset at 1,000. So therefore, that's credit prepaid rent. And then, kailangan tumaas si rent expense ng 1,000. So that would be debit rent expense. So putting that together, we will have debit rent expense, credit prepaid rent. Tumaas si expense, bumaba si asset. So looking at it mathematically, how will you solve for it? Pag may nakita kayo dyan, huwag kayo matakot kung ilang months, etc., etc. Just get the number of months covered or period covered. Divide that and then multiply it to kung ano yung na-consume mo. So rent paid is 3,000, divide natin by 3,000. So technically, ang monthly expense natin is 1,000. Ilang months ba yung na-consume natin? March 1 to March 31, 1 month lang. So since 1 month lang, we will now debit rent expense of 1,000, credit prepaid rent of 1,000. So pag tini-account nyo siya, again, si prepaid rent, it started at 3,000, yun yung buong asset. A portion of it will now be considered as an expense kasi yun yung actually consumed mo. So magiging 2,000 na lang si prepaid rent and that portion will now be transferred to expense at 1,000. Yun. So, any questions for prepaid rent, prepaid insurance, etc., etc.? Clear naman so far? So, basically, ganun lang siya. Parang it adds another layer of analysis lang naman. But don't be intimidated. The idea lang is, try to determine ano yung portion of the assets that we will convert to expense. Now, the last for deferrals for prepaid expenses is equipment depreciation. So, it's kind of different compared to supplies and prepaid rent. So kindly bear with me in terms of like just trying to understand why equipment is such a special account for us. So let's say bumili ka ng computer. So may 5 years left ka in March 31. So 5 years left. So yung life round ng computer mo is 5 years. And then basically after 1 month, ang magiging na lang is may 4 years, 11 months left ka na lang. Parang technically, parang may life yung equipment mo. So basically, yung recording natin for March 1 is basically straightforward. Debit equipment, credit cash of 2,400. Now, unlike rent or anything else, ang equipment, binabawasan natin siya based on its depreciation, meaning nagdi-depreciate yung value niya. So, I don't know if you've noticed, parang kung I think Apple is notorious for this. Every time may nare-release na bagong iOS na bago, people claim na bumabagal raw their softwares, etc., etc., because parang they're being pressured to buy something new, right? So, whether how much of that is true or not, what is true is the more you use an equipment, the more you use a gadget, the more na bumabagal siya or the more na nagbe-breakdown siya, right? So, we then call that a passage of depreciation. So, from 5 years, let's say, so sa accounting, hindi naman kasi natin malalaman parang gaano kabilis mag-depreciate yung mga bagay-bagay. So, we use an estimate. So, let's say a laptop on estimate lasts for 5 years. So, since binili mo siya March 1, technically, out of those 5 years, may 4 years and 11 months left ka pa. So, we now need to recognize an expense related to that equipment. So now, how did we get 2,360? We basically divided it by 5 times 12, 60. So basically what we did is 2,400 divided by 60 will get a monthly depreciation expense of 40. So dapat ang equipment natin should lower by 40 and expense should increase by 40. Now the question is, so sabihin nyo, okay, gets na namin to. Therefore, our journal entry should be debit depreciation expense, credit, equipment. Ganun yung iisipin nyo. But the only thing that's different is that unlike other accounts, equipment, meron lang siyang other account called accumulated depreciation. So rather than doing debit expense 40 and credit equipment, please take note na it's called accumulated depreciation. So this is a new account and please take note what it does. So accumulated depreciation is recorded as contra asset. So basically, equipments are always recorded at kung gaano mo siya binili. And then, para lang malaman mo kung ano yung tunay na value niya, ibabangga mo yung equipment value with its accumulated depreciation. So in the financial position, this is what it would look like. That this equipment, regardless of how many parang years ko siya ginamit, it will always be at 2,400. Hindi yan gagalaw. Ang gagalaw lang is how much yung accumulated depreciation yung tataas. So in the next month, it's gonna be 80. In the next month, it's gonna be 120. And then, to get your net equipment, you will just subtract 40 from 2,400. So that you'll get property, plant, and equipment net of 2,360. So dahil contra asset account siya, meaning ano ang normal balance ng accumulated depreciation? Ano ang normal balance ng equipment? Asset, which is debit, right? So dahil contra asset siya, meaning baliktad siya, parang tinatry niya bawasan, it's technically like negative, right? Equipment minus accumulated depreciation. So ang normal balance na accumulated depreciation is credit. Okay, so yun lang yung tatandaan niya. Yeah. It's under asset. So if in the financial statement, di ba, may liabilities and equity na here. Parang here, it's a contra asset. So under equipment, palagi magkakaroon ng parang less accumulated depreciation. And then this will be a negative. So that at the end, parang you'll be able to get na yung net equipment is 2,360. Yun. Good question. Yun. So basically, paano natin ginuha yun mathematically? It's just basically 2,400 divided the useful life in years. So 5. So 24 divided by 5. So yeah, 480. And then 480 divided by 12 is equal to 40. So dahil 1 month lang yung nagamit natin, depreciation expense of 40, accumulated depreciation of 40. So honestly, it's the same concept. Dinagdagan lang natin ng term na accumulated depreciation. So don't be rattled. So ito, 40 and then 40. And then basically hindi naggalaw si equipment under the T account. Pero again, please take note na at the end naman, ma-show mo pa rin sa financial position na it was deducted. Are there any questions for supplies, prepaid rent, or equipment? Or clear pa naman so far? Okay. So with that said, we're done now with 1 out of the 4 things that we have to do. Naka-record na tayo ng supplies, naka-record na tayo ng prepaid rent, and naka-record na tayo ng equipment. So, please take note lang, itong initial recording, naka-reflect na to sa trial balance. Ang titignan nila lang is yung adjusting entry na 900, 1,040. So ito, yung 24,150, itong lahat naka-reflect na to sa trial balance. Yung adjusting entries, hindi pa. Right? So, the reason lang kung bakit ko pinakita sa inyo yung initial recording is so that hindi kayo magugulo kung ano ba yung ina-adjust natin. So, unearned rent revenue. Right. So, basically, let's go na to the kabaliktaran of prepaid expenses. So, ito, you receive cash now, so may liability ka, and then yung buong liability niyan, unti-unti, i-recognize mo as revenue as you perform the obligation. So, let's take note lang, let's take a break from the case study. Let's look at the perspective of the company that rented to them. Right. So now, rented out an office. So basically, same scenario, different POV. So wag kayo malito, this is the POV of the seller. So CHLC building to. So in March 1, nakabenta ka ng 3 months worth of rent. So what you'll recognize is debit cash, 3,000. Credit, liability, unearned revenue, 3,000. May liability ka sa kanya. You have to make sure na for the 3 months, may enjoy na yung rent niya for that particular property. Now, 1 month has passed, right? Now, 2 months have passed. Let's say April 30 na. What should be how much yung revenue that you should recognize after 2 months? 2,000, right? Kasi 3,000 divided by 3 is 1 monthly rent revenue of 1,000. March 1, March to April 30 is March, April. So 1,000 times 2, 2,000. So now, yung unearned rent liability mo, ang liability mo na lang is 1 month worth of rent. So therefore, your liabilities are overstated. Right now, before adjustment, it's 3,000. Kailangan pababain natin siya to 1,000. Therefore, our adjustment is decrease 2,000 unearned rent revenue, which is a liability account. And then revenues are understated, so we have to recognize revenue of 2,000. So that would mean increase revenue, so that's debit 2,000. Decrease unearned rent revenue, liability, so that's debit 2,000. Increase rent revenue of 2,000. So this is again the mathematical way of doing it. So 3,000 divided by 3, monthly revenue of 1,000. And then, since 2 months, 1,000 times 2, so unearned rent revenue and 2,000. So again, just to show you, unearned rent revenue is a liability account. So ang normal balance is a credit. Because of that, pag binawasan natin siya, it's 2,000. So ang liability na natin at the end is 1,000 and rent revenue of 2,000. So honestly, yun lang. That we're done, we're halfway done for deferrals. So again, deferrals talk about may payment ka or na-receive kang cash at the start. And then dine-defer mo yung pag-recognize of an expense and a revenue. Simply put, if it's a prepaid expense, what usually happens is you'll recognize an asset muna. And then unti-unti, you'll recognize it back to expenses. In contrast, for unearned revenue, ititreat mo muna siya buo as liability. And then unti-unti, dun mo i-recognize yung revenue as you perform. Are there any questions for deferrals or cash now? Okay. So now, next is cash later. So accruals would be cash later. So accruals, baliktad. For accruals, you recognize the revenue now, and then yung receiving of cash later. And then for accrued expenses, you recognize the expense now, pero you pay the cash later. So honestly, ang pinakamahirap out of the 4 should be should be prepaid expenses. For this, medyo may alam na tayo dito because unknowingly we've been using it na in chapter 2. So, ang good thing in accruals is wala kang initial entry. Wala kang initial entry kasi wala ka namang nirecognize eh. Yung first point lang of revenue and first point of expense, that's the thing that you need to adjust for. So therefore, since i-recognize mo yung revenue, pag hindi mo ginawa yun, your assets are understated and your revenues are understated because wala kang nirecognize na revenue and corresponding asset. And then, baliktad naman sa accrued expense. So liabilities are understated and expenses are understated because wala ka pang na-recognize na expense, which is debit expense and liability. So in memorizing this, as much as possible, i-memorize mo rin ito, yung impacts nito if hindi mo ginawa. Pero intuitively, malalaman mo naman eh, na parang if hindi mo ginawa to, then understated si asset kasi wala kang na-recognize. Understated si revenue kasi wala kang na-recognize. On the other hand, for accrued expenses, liabilities are understated kasi wala kang na-recognize na liability. Expenses are understated because wala kang na-recognize na expense. Right? So let's just basically jump into an example para mas madali. Accrued revenue. So at the end of the month, Pudi Consulting finished an engagement at XYZ Enterprise amounting to 400. But the client has not yet been billed. So, first question is, so my March 31 and then my next period end. So, we'll probably get the cash later. So, after March 31 pa natin makukuha. But on March 31, nakatapos na tayo ng engagement and we go back to revenue recognition. Na perform mo ng service, therefore, you have to record the revenue of how much? 400. Therefore, nung March 31, wala kang initial entry. So now, ang accounts receivable mo is 0 and revenue is 0. When in fact, you should have recorded an accounts receivable of 400 and a service revenue of 400. Because, tapos mo na yung engagement worth 400. So, ang accruals lang, basically yun yung ginagawa natin before. AR or accounts receivable 400. Credit service revenue of 400. So that's when we recognize the revenue. So, ang adjusting entry lang is, dadagdagan lang natin si receivables and si service revenue. So, magiging 10,000 pa lang. For accrued expenses, the same thing happens. Walang initial entry. However, ang mga nagpapahirap nito, so, madali si accrued revenues, mahirap si accrued expense. Why? Because we just have to be smart in terms of computing, right? So first is interest expense. So I don't know if you have an experience na umutang kayo sa bangko or anything like that. Pero basically, you'll always see an interest rate. This is one of the things na I'll mention. Kapag may nakita kayong interest rate, the underlying assumption is that that's an annual rate. That's an annual rate. So meaning, yung 3% na interest of 8,000, or let's say 10,000, umutang ko 10,000, I have an interest rate of 10%. Yung 1,000 na yun, that interest is for 12 months. That's the assumption. Pag may nakita kayong interest rate, the assumption is that's for 1 year. So, again, let's do a timeline. On March 31, nag-borrow ka raw ng 8,000 payable. So now, we just have to incur na, okay, every month, kailangan mag-incur ka ng interest expense out of that 8,000 na payable. So basically, what's 3% of 8,000 divided by 12? That's 20. So now we have to recognize a debit interest expense, credit interest payable of 20. So how did we arrive at 20? 8,000 is the principal. You multiply the interest rate of 3% to get your annual interest rate, meaning for the whole year, 240 interest mo. Pero we're looking at it from 1 month lang. So 240 divided by 12 is equal to 20. So ang monthly expense natin is we should recognize a debit interest expense, credit interest payable of 20. So now, bakit nagkakamali mga tao? Two things. Mali yung pag-compute nila ng interest monthly expense. And number 2, nakakalimutan nila. So parang kunin, may long prob kami na ibibigay sa inyo. Automatic, pag may nakita kayong note payable tapos may interest, always think, may corresponding interest expense, interest payable. Hindi na namin kayo i-remind na what is the journal entry to recognize interest expense? Automatic. Pag may nakita kayong utang, pag may nakita kayong interest expense, and then may end of the period, always think, may hidden interest expense, may hidden interest payable na I always have to take note of. So, yun lang yung mga common mistakes here. So, basically, you recognize that so that you can get that. And then lastly, is salaries expense. So, basically, parang Podi Consulting pays 1,000 salaries a week for a 5-day work week. And the end of the month fell on a Wednesday. So, basically, ano mangyayari dito? We need to recognize a salaries payable and salaries expense for March 31. And therefore, the adjusting entry is debit salaries expense, salaries payable. Now, the question is, paano natin nakuha yung 600 from that 1,000? Basically, ang titingnan nyo is, to simplify this, every day kasi, binabayaran ka of 1,000. So, for 1 week, 1,000 yung binabayad sa'yo. So, magkano yung daily wage mo? 1,000 divided by 5 is 200. Now, ang nangyari kasi is, March 31 is on a Wednesday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, March pa yon. So, 200, 200, 200. Ang utang ko sa kanya is 600 for that month. On March 31, may utang ako sa kanya na technically 3 days work siya gumamit. So, I owe him a salaries expense of 600. So, I have a salaries payable of 600. Ano yung gagawin ko dun sa 200, 200 ng Thursday and Friday? That's for the next month. That will be recognized as salaries expense cash. So, ang mangyayari is magbabayad ako ng cash. And then, basically, everything will be paid off. So, I think this would be simpler if, let's try to draw it. Para lang, so basically, ang sinasabi lang dito kasi is that, salaries, so salaries, they're paid usually at the end of the week, right? So, we go to parang, let's say, week 3 of that. And then, alam natin na 1,000 yung bayad sa kanila. So, you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Let's say this is just like March 25. Let's say. So, nasa time period pa tayo. Walang nag-cross. So, ang mangyayari is, okay, nagtrabaho siya dito, nagtrabaho siya dito, nagtrabaho siya dito, nagtrabaho siya dito. Okay, babayaran ko siya dito sa Friday. So, therefore, may journal entry ako dito na salaries expense and then cash of 1,000. So, may journal entry ako for week 3. Right? So, walang problema. Ang nagkakaproblema lang is, paano kung yung end of the month tumama on a day na hindi mo siya babayaran? You still have to recognize the expense on that month. So, let's say, sa week 4, 1,000 pa rin yung sweldo nila per week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, natapos yung month, end of month. Thursday, sa Friday mo pa siya babayaran. So technically, wala kang i-recognize na entry here kasi wala kang binayad na cash, right? Pero what accrual basis is saying is that you should recognize na may utang ka na salaries expense for the last 3 days of the month. So ano yung journal entry natin sa March 31? Basically, may salaries expense ka kasi may trabaho sila worth 3 days. Pero the question is, how much should this be? Hindi siya pwedeng 1,000 buo. Kung split to into divided by 5 days, they have a daily wage of 200. So, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, so times 3, ang utang ko lang is 600. So, ang salaries expense mo is 600. And then you have cash of 600. Ito yung journal entry na you have to make for week 4. Now the question is, Friday na, and this is gonna be April 2. Magbabayad ka na. paano mo i-journal entry to? Ay, sorry. This is not salary. This is payable. Salaries payable. So for those na parang nagkakaka, okay, so ano yung itsura ng April 2? Journal entry. Yung babayaran mo na siya ng 1,000. Well, obviously, alam natin, may debit cash of 1,000. And then, yung 1,000 na yun, split to bayad mo sa March and bayad mo dun sa first 2 days of April. So now, that would be salaries payable of 600 kasi dinirecognize mo na yung liability. Babayaran mo na eh. So this is pertaining to the last 3 days of March. And then you have salaries expense of what? 400. To recognize the expense for the 2 days na tinrabaho niya for April. So basically, ganun lang yun. So for me, ang nagpapahirap lang for salaries is paano nyo lang i-compute to. So tandaan nyo lang, it's very mechanical. So, pero ganun lang how it works. Na you have to determine lang ano ba yung daily wage nila. And then parang how many days yung na-incur nila so that you can get the salaries for this. Yun. So actually, with that said, we're done now with basically everything, right? So, we're done with accrued revenues. Nag-recognize na tayo ng receivable. We're done with an interest expense. And then we're done with the salaries expense, right? So, basically, in a nutshell, yun lang naman yung deferrals and accruals natin. So, know how to adjust for deferrals, know how to adjust for accruals. Ano lang yung nagpahirap? Understanding and then computing for it. So, tapusin na natin yung scenario. So, the adjusted trial balance is yung basically i-reflect na natin yung adjusting entries. So, again, going back at the start, today is the last day of the accounting period. We now have tapos na tayo to record adjusting entries, which are deferrals. We're done recording adjusting entries, which are accruals. The last step is adjust na natin yung trial balance. So basically, these are the 6 deferrals and accruals that we created. So 1 for supplies, 1 for prepaid rent, 1 for equipment, 1 for accrued revenue, 1 for interest expense, and finally 1 for salaries expense. So basically, ang gagawin lang naman natin is turning that into a table, right? So turning that into a table. Okay. Sorry. So turning that into a table, right? So now, basically parang pinlagin lang natin. So supplies expense, kailangan plus 900 debit. Supplies, plus 900 credit. Rent expense, kailangan plus 1,000, etc. etc. So now that you have that table, i-reflect mo na lang yung summarized adjustments, right? So first, supplies expense. So supplies, hanapin natin yung office supplies, yung supplies expense. So it's 0. So kailangan magdagdag tayo ng 900. Step 2, supplies. 900, kailangan raw may credit siya of 900. So yung office supplies is 3,000. So paano natin yung gagawin? It's a 900 credit for supplies. Technically, so that would mean what? What will we do? So kung 3,000 debit, sorry, hindi ko makita. Huwag na lang. Okay, so anyways, so since 3,000 yung debit, minus a credit of 900, this should be 50. Next, rent expense. So hanapin natin si rent expense. So plus 1,000 sa debit. So you have 1,000. Prepaid rent. So hanapin natin si prepaid rent. So 3,000 siya right now. It's overstated. So now we have to subtract 1,000. So naging 2,000. Depreciation expense. So hanapin lang natin si depreciation expense. So that's 40. Accumulated depreciation of equipment. So again, hindi natin sinusubtract sa equipment. So that's ACDEP nandun. So that's 40. And then accounts receivable of 400. So next, journal entry 4. Ano tayo ng accruals for accrued revenue. So accounts receivable plus 400. So hanapin lang natin sa accounts receivable. It's right now, it's at 3,000. So 3,000 plus 400 magiging 3,400. Service revenue of 400. So service revenue 400. So 10,400. And then interest expense. Hanapin nyo lang sa interest expense. So 20. Interest payable, 20. Salaries expense. So from 3.8, so basically the 3.8 represents how much yung binayad niya for week 1, week 2, week 3. Kailangan lang natin dagdagan ng 600, so 4,400. And then salaries payable is 600. And then basically, if you add all the new debits, you'll have 25,210. And then if you add the credits, you'll have 25,210. So now, the last step is we make financial statements. So basically back to regular programming, right? So for this, to train you, the seat work for today. So again, seat works, don't sweat about it. I just want you to do it in terms of like a hard written paper. Paulit-ulit lang to. Create your 3 income statements. Yun. And then dapat you'll be able to finish that within 15 minutes, right? So parang ganun lang yung idea. So again, parang yun, parang so at the end, kindly give me na lang that income statement and then also yung homework nyo if dinala nyo yung for problem set 2. Yun. Sabihin nyo lang kung medyo maliit, pero maliit. Sorry. Wait, sorry. Papalakihin ko. Sorry. Yeah. I think that's okay. Sige. So, I think we can discuss. So, yun. So, I think super quick lang. Pasadahan na lang natin. So, this is really more of to confirm kung gamay niya na yung income statements and everything. So, like what I've mentioned, this should be mechanical for us. So, income statement, basically do the three headers for the month and then revenues, expenses, net income. Our revenues is 10,400. Our expenses should be ordered by magnitude. So, ang total expenses should be 6,960. And then our net income or net loss would therefore be 3,440. Okay? So, okay lang kahit ano, pero please take note kung anong accounts kayo nagkamali. Statement of changes in owner's equity, big capital, dahil starting 0, what would be our additions? 6,000 na investment of owner's capital and then the net income from the income statement. So 9,440. Drawings, 2,000. 7,440. And then, ano yung balance natin for our assets and liabilities and equity? 16,210. Okay. Good. Things to note lang, order of liquidity. Yung act debt will always be lower than equipment. And then, other things. Account payable, salary payable, interest payable, not payable. Yun. So, honestly, may last thing pa. But then I think for this, parang feel free to just look at it sa recording. No need to, Pero this will help you lang in your answering the exercises. So, for me, ayoko lang kayo guluhin kanina, pero may alternative method in terms of answering. So, di ba may deferrals tayo at accruals? Only deferrals have an alternative method. So, meaning, prepaid expenses and unearned revenue have alternative methods. Okay, so anong ibig sabihin ng alternative record, right? Sorry. So, going back to the prepaid rent, yung primary method natin is we recognize an asset first and then eventually ginagawa natin expense. An alternative method to this is baliktad. So, yan. So, ang alternative method natin for this is, ito yung primary method natin. We recognize the rent of 3,000 and then we said, 1 month has passed, so we recognize an expense. And then therefore, yung prepaid rent will be at the end 2,000 and then expense is 1,000. Ang alternative method is rather than recognizing a prepaid rent, babalik na rin nila. You'll recognize the entirety of the cash as an expense first at the start of the 3 months. So rent expense ng 3 months, pero at the end of the month, determine mo, out of the 3,000 expense, technically, out of those 3,000, ilan pa yung technically asset ko? Eh di ba ang alam natin is that 1 month has passed, so technically dapat 1,000 yung expense natin. And therefore, ang prepaid rent, we have to increase by 2,000. And then yung expense will decrease by 2,000. So that pag pinagbangga mo to, you'll have an expense of 1,000 and then prepaid rent pa rin of 2,000. So same lang yung net niya. It's just that ang difference is here, we recognize an asset first and then eventually turn it into an expense. Versus ito, baliktad. We recognize the entirety is expense and then eventually we'll turn some in terms of like the assets. So yun lang, parang pag hiningi yung alternative method, try nyo lang for the exercise. I won't be strict for that particular portion of the problem set. And then for unearned revenue, pareho lang rin. So using this as an example, di ba we had 3,000 and then we recognize 2 months worth of revenue. So basically, ang ginawa natin is 3,000, we first recognize it as liability, and then 2 months of rent yung na-earn. So eventually, ginawa natin siyang 2,000 worth of revenue. Yung alternative method instead of treating it as a liability, ginawa na natin siyang service revenue buo, and then determine lang natin at the end of 2 months, ilan pa iba yung utang ko, and then you determine na 1 month's worth. So, kaya, unearned service revenue, 1,000. So, I will send the slides over and then parang please digest na lang. So, the reason why I wanted to quickly pasada lang is so that you won't be confused in terms of like understanding it. Pero,
lalabas to sa problem set. So, if ever, don't be surprised, just read the slides. Pero, ang kailangan muna is ilam nyo yung primary method. Ito lang talaga parang pang-appreciation. And then lastly, to end, super quick, sorry. Last 1 minute. To end, I don't know if you've noticed, pero wala pa tayong example of so basically, yun lang. So some reminders lang muna before I go to the last one. And then officially end the recording. Wednesday, quiz 1. Like what I mentioned, dahil 8:30 naman yung start, we'll start at 8:30. Pero my request lang is, if kaya nyo 8:15, I'll be here 8:15. So kung kaya 8:15, pero let's start na lang at 8:30. Ang implication nun is, medyo mas mabilis tayo sumagot ng exercises if 8:30 tayo magsa-start. So, yun. And then please be there on time. Yun lang naman. So face-to-face tayo Wednesday. Pero dahil face-to-face sa Wednesday, bawi tayo Friday, online na lang tayo per Friday. Yun. And then, so I'll end the recording.